Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am Christine Dixon of The Ordinary Sacred, and I'm so happy you are back with me in our lovely van. And I'm excited to tell you about Chapter 12 of Outshining Trauma by Ralph De La Rosa. And again, I'm very honored to pass on the just very practical, wise, loving teachings that Ralph has in their book. And so let's see, chapter 12 is all about mapping our parts, which again is such a practical thing. And so in this video, I'm going to show you the parts map that Ralph uses. It's very similar to a parts map that I have used in my for my inner family and that I would use with clients. And I would always send them like a little template so they could use it, little PDF, but it's really not needed at all because you can draw it very easily. So I'm going to show you that via Ralph's book, and then I'm going to describe a couple of examples of clusters of parts in parts maps that Ralph gives in the book, because examples are really helpful, I think, in understanding how to use this. So the first thing is I really love the quote at the beginning of chapter 12, which is called Making the Unseen Seen, about parts mapping. And it's a quote from Krishnamurti, which says, "When I understand myself, I understand you. And out of that understanding comes love." I love that quote because, especially in a world right now, well, and throughout history where there's just a lot of violence and um, fighting between various groups, I strongly believe that the way forward is to understand ourselves and the polarized parts that fight within us, and to bring loving self energy to everything that arises in us. Because when we're able to do that, then we can see the parts in other people that are perhaps harming us, but protecting them. And we can say, well, I disagree with that, but I understand your intention is protective. And as we understand and appreciate our own parts, we can understand and appreciate other people's parts and love them, which basically means we're turning self energy toward our own parts and then also able to turn it toward others. Okay, so as we map our parts, it's a way of for us to really get and understand and give loving attention to our parts. So it's a wonderful practical way forward. And then Ralph talks about Carl Jung's quote of making the unconscious conscious, right? In the last video, we talked about Buddha meaning one who is awake, right? When we make the unconscious conscious, we are awake. That's really what being awake means, right? So as we begin to be aware of the parts inside of us and why they do what they do and what they're protecting, and bring the exiles out of exile, because essentially the exiles are in our subconscious or unconscious, and we bring them into consciousness, into loving consciousness, we become integrated, we become harmonious, we become awake. Okay. So now Ralph gives a nod here to the wonderful book by Michelle Glass called Daily Parts Meditation Practice. This it continues to be probably in my top 5 IFS books. I've now probably read over 40 um, in books on internal family systems. And I love Michelle Glass's book, Daily Parts Meditation Practice, because it's so practical. She just gives example after example after example of ways to externalize your parts. Because if you can externalize your parts, you are aware of them. You're bringing them from the unconscious into the conscious, and you can relate to them. So whether you use beads or rocks or sticks or stuffed animals or drawings or you name it, right? It's a way of externalizing it so that we can relate to it. So I too highly recommend that book. Um, and then Ralph says on page 138, integration is what happens anytime we make our inner experience external in some way. Uh, and then Ralph talks about having a manager part that was like, dude, you want more paperwork in your life? And then essentially the self responding and saying, our healing is so important that yes, some paperwork, some paperwork might be involved. So technically, the method that Ralph's talking about here is paperwork. And so you can, if you have parts that resist that, negotiate with them, say, hey, can we try just a little bit, see if it's helpful or not. So then they might, have more buy-in and say, okay, uh, I'm willing to do more of this. Really, what parts need is they need autonomy and freedom of choice, right? So a lot of times when parts resist, this is the same with people on the outside of us, by the way. In nonviolent communication, if a person outside of us or a part inside of us basically says no, like has resistance, it's because they have an unmet need or concern, right? And a lot of times that unmet need is for freedom, autonomy of choice. And so we always want to give our parts freedom of choice and say, and propose an experiment. Like, can we try this? And you have veto power. You can just say, no, I don't like it. And then we can try something else, right? And see what really works for our system. It doesn't have to look exactly like Ralph's map or my map or anything in Michelle Glass's book, even though there's so many options there, which is so lovely because your system can find one that genuinely feels life-giving and the system feels motivated, to do. Okay. So the way that Ralph, oh, I want to say one more note from page 139 that I like that Ralph discloses. They say, I personally have a cluster of at least 7 parts that show up in intimate relationships as my attachment style. I love that because it's just this intersection of, many of you have probably heard of attachment styles, right? Of avoidant or anxious or disorganized, right? Or secure. And so a lot of people who've experienced trauma or attachment wounding have a lot of parts that develop, wounded parts in the subconscious, protective parts, and that is a way in IFS to explain and describe attachment style. It's not like you are a monomind and you have this attachment style. It's comprised of a cluster of parts who have organized to protect you in a certain way. And you may have parts who are uh, avoidant and parts who are anxious. You may have some parts that are secure, right? So, um, in the examples, you'll kind of see this. But before I show you the examples, let me just show you the main map. I thought about making a slide for this, but hopefully you can see it on here. Okay, yeah, I think you can. I actually wrote self there in the egg yolk. Ralph basically says it's like an egg, right? There's an oval, and then there's a yolk in the center to one side that represents the self that is inside of you and all of us. And then I don't know if you can see this, exiles are right next to the self. And the reason that Ralph says that they put exiles there is because they're kind of the most buried, like deep in our psyche. And so it's not necessarily that they're closer to the self. They can be, and they often have self qualities when they're unburdened. But the reason is more because they are more hidden, right? They're more kind of in the center of our being that is exiled, hidden in our subconscious, right? So, and then here on the line, I don't know if you can see it says manager. And you can draw this now if you want to have an image to refer to later. But so this is manager here. So this is self. And then there's exiles that are in the inside here. And then managers are on the outer line because managers are really the ones who are on the surface. They're the ones that we interact with, that we see evidence of regularly, that control our lives on a daily basis. And so they are out front and center and in the consciousness more so than other parts. All right. And then outside of that whole circle are the firefighters. And you and I might not be able to see that, but that says firefighter. And so So the way the map would work is that exiles would be put up here near self, managers would be put here along the line, and then firefighters would be out here. And the reason that Ralph says that they put firefighters outside the circle is because firefighters are not always active. So managers are preventative, so they're often doing a job very regularly because they are on constant duty to prevent the pain of the exiles from coming out to the surface. So they're kind of guarding the outside and doing a job regularly, whereas the firefighters only come in once the manager's job has not worked and those exiles break out into consciousness. That's when we feel really overwhelmed with extreme emotions and beliefs, right? When that happens, the firefighters are the rescue team that swoop in to get those exiles back in, to numb the system, to soothe it, to escape, to deflect it out, right? They have all of their jobs, but they only come in periodically when the exiles are activated and come to the surface. Okay? So I hope that makes sense. So now, what I want to do is give you some examples of that Ralph gives. I'm just going to give you the two examples that Ralph gives in the book, and then maybe you can try this, though I'll say here, I really like what Ralph says about this is not necessarily a job. Sometimes we might have managers that are like, oh, they have a lot of um, gusto and kind of urgency and energy around let's map all the parts that we're even potentially aware of right now. That's not really the goal of this exercise. This mapping piece comes after you've gotten to know some parts through meditation or journaling. And as you get curious about them and you're open and you ask them questions and they reveal things to you, it's like more and more of the puzzle pieces come together around a specific part, around how it's related to or relates to another part. If it's protecting it, it's polarized with it, it's hates it, loves it, whatever, right? You start to begin to fill in the bigger picture. And as you are gaining these pieces of information experientially and, direct answers from parts through meditation and journaling, direct communication with your parts, as you get the information, you are externalizing it and putting it on the map at that point. So it's not necessarily helpful to try to map before you get the information. Um, I used to do that. I used to, counsel clients even to do that, to just brainstorm on the map parts they thought they might have. But I really, and so you can't get it wrong. It's not like it's terrible if you do that. But I do think that it is more effective, uh, as Ralph is saying it, right? You get to know the parts and then you map them. So just some examples though. And I like how Ralph says in this first one, um, I think the client goes by J. Yeah, the letter J. And Ralph says this is a cluster of parts in a person who experiences a lot of anxiety. Okay. I love this because you will not see a part on here that is called the anxious part because all parts can experience anxiety. So Ralph's going to show the different parts and their experiences and their jobs. And as they relate to each other and do their jobs, there is an experience of anxiety in the system, right? So, okay. Now it's hard to know which part to say first. Um, So I'm going to talk about the exiles first, but often in experience, the exiles are the last that you're going to find. The exiles are the ones who drive the jobs of the manager and the firefighters, right? So that's why I'm going to tell you about them first. But often when you are uncovering this puzzle, you will see the firefighter activity and the manager activity first, and you'll start to get to know them, and they will eventually usher you into the exiles. Okay, but as we look at this person's system as a whole, they have two exiles. Okay, so there's circles next to self energy here. One is called Jeannie and is a teenager. And this teenage part was sexually assaulted. So that's the trauma that that part stuck in. And then also had many unwanted advances from cisgendered men throughout life and carries the burden of mistrusting all men, especially partners, as a result. Okay. And then there's a second exile in this cluster of parts in this person called Little Dragon. And this part is age 7. And the experience of this part was their caregivers fighting about money. And so there's this burden of a belief that was formed that said, if I am not good with money, I will not be loved. Like there will be conflict and strife if I'm not good with money. There's this pressure. And then this generates this background of fear of failure at financial things, right? Like job or socially. Okay, so there are these two exiles in the person's system that are holding these experiences, these traumas, or stuck back in those times, re-experiencing them constantly, and then holding these beliefs around mistrusting men and, you know, this fear if I'm not good with money, I won't be loved, I won't be valued. And so managers then form to try to keep the pain and the angst and the intensity of these parts away from the surface. So the first one is the taskmaster, what Ralph is calling the taskmaster. And Ralph says that their job is to feel safe by being in control, always in control. And they're rigid about following rules, and they're a people pleaser, especially around men and authority figures. So you might ask, well, the exile mistrusts men. This part is saying we've got to people please men, right? So it's because the manager's job is to say, okay, men can't be trusted. They are going to harm us and they're going to activate this part that feels overwhelmed. So we have got to always be following the rules and pleasing the men and especially the authority figures so that we don't get that backlash from them. It's still a distrust of the men. It's like, I've got to placate you. I've got to make sure, that you don't erupt on me, right? So, but it's a strategy to try to prevent the pain from men happening again. Okay. And I was going to say with that, and I think Ralph is actually trying to keep it relatively simple here because what this person might eventually find is that there's a whole cluster of parts there. There's the part that has to be in control, that taskmaster, and then there's also the part in charge of learning what all the rules are and making sure they follow them. And then there's a people pleasing, perhaps cluster of parts as well. All right. But the second manager that Ralph says here is the analyst. And the job of the analyst is to understand situations, people, and emotions because it leads to success. So some of you may have this part, may relate to this. It's a part that's constantly analyzing everything. If I can just understand it, I can predict what this person's going to do or what's going to happen in this situation. It's partly a way of staying in control. And again, to prevent um, the maybe a mistake, right, in finances or in a job or socially, that could lead to the pain of these exiles coming up. All right. So then finally, on the outside of the circle or away from the circle is the firefighter that is called the Iron Fist. And Ralph says when mistakes are made, the Iron Fist gets very tense and conceives of new rules to run a tighter ship. It can become very highly critical of self and others. Now, I'm probably projecting here, but I have separate parts that are critical of me, a whole army of parts that are critical of other parts of me. And then I have other parts that are critical of other people. Now, again, you just have to go in and ask the part, right? Are you the same part? Are you different parts? But it may be one part that's in charge of criticizing either way. But it sounds like, again, this part has several jobs, right? So it might be a cluster of parts, it might be one, but it's to it was interesting. It said that create new, stricter rules to run a tighter ship. So it's kind of like the manager part that kept track of all the rules. Their job didn't work if the exiles are coming into awareness. So now the firefighters got to rush in and make even stronger rules, right? And like just make up rules. Because if following these rules didn't work, then we've got to take it up a notch, right? And that's why firefighters are often quite extreme because they're desperate. It's like, wow, we had this whole defense system and it's been broken through. And so now we've got to come to the rescue. Okay. Um, so then Ralph basically describes a scenario in which Jay is pulled into the office of her male superior, who essentially reprimands her and says, you're not doing a good enough job, you're going to be demoted, you're going to lose pay, or, you could potentially lose your job. And so, of course, that in itself is going to activate the exiles because essentially the defense system of the managers that we're trying to always keep track of the rules and people please and placate the male authority, um, and you know analyze everything to try to be in control and stay safe. Essentially, that didn't work. Now the fear is happening, right? This male authority is upset in front of you. So now these exile parts are going to come up. So Jay runs out of the room, runs to the bathroom, is crying, the pain of that of I'm not lovable because I'm a failure, right? And these male people can't be trusted and are, you know, going to harm me. Like all of those burdens and fears and pain and beliefs are coming flooding to the surface now. And because that has come up now in her consciousness, Iron Fist comes in, right? She's there in the bathroom crying. Iron Fist says, "You terrible, awful thing. You did this wrong. We've got to do better," right? Turns this critical sense onto her wounded parts, which likely only exacerbates things if she's anything like me. But might work in some ways to say, honestly, she may have a part that says, just end it all. This pain is too much. You're a failure. That kind of thing. It might go in that direction, or there might be other parts that are turn that criticism outward and say, look at him, that jerk, that he's terrible, awful person. I knew he was. He's a man, right? And, might turn the anger outward and lash out in some kind of way. I I wonder. I'm just, I have a hunch that maybe her system wouldn't do that because her managers wouldn't let it happen. So now there's this polarization between the managers that are like, we have to follow the rules and we have to, you know, make sure that we return to a place of safety where we're loved and secure and have a job and everything. Um, but if the firefighter takes over, could could lash out at the manager and get her fired, and then the exiles are going to be even bigger. Okay. So, um, I like at the end of this section, Ralph says, Jay might think that the answer here, this is on page 144. Jay might think the answer here is to learn to control her anxiety, to become better at regulating her big emotions, to stop making mistakes at work. What would offer much more substantial, lasting, and empowering relief, however, would be for Jay to heal her exiles. While this would be longer term work that would begin with befriending the manager and firefighters involved, Jay could eventually unburden both Little Dragon and Jeannie, effectively discharging the stored energy of their early traumas from Jay's body. And this would leave space for Jay to encounter future stressors without overflowing. And along the way, Jay's managers and firefighter parts would develop a relationship to self energy and could begin allowing self to lead her with qualities of calm, clarity, creativity, curiosity, etc. in her relationships. Okay, so um I'm going to make a decision actually to not do the second example. You got to buy the book to see the second example. It's a cluster of parts in a person with tendency toward depression, which I appreciate because often when people say, is depression a part? I'll say, well, it's likely a whole cluster of parts. Um, and there might be a part that pulls you into uh, like numbness, like numbs emotion or complacency or lack of energy or something. But why? Why is that strategy? Why is it doing that? Right? And there's lots of other parts. And so there's often manic depression because there's a polarization between the parts who are pulling in depression and the parts who are trying to balance that out with mania or vice versa. And so anyway, I won't give all of that away, but my throat's getting dry and I'm feeling tired. So uh I just want to say though, I'm going to show you. I know you can't read it, but just kind of what that map that I just described looked like, right? Here's Jay's exile parts, the manager parts, and then this firefighter iron fist over here. So that's how the map of, and this isn't Jay's complete system, right? This is just the parts that are mapped around perhaps this experience, maybe the experience with the boss happened, and that was a trailhead. And then Jay got curious about what parts were active throughout that experience, what parts felt defeated because their job didn't work, right? And maybe got to know the managers. Likely noticed the firefighters and the exiles, but again, once we can get curious after the fact, right, it becomes a really valuable trailhead to get curious about the parts involved and they begin to tell us about themselves. And then we can put them on a map like that, which really helps us have perspective, which is a self quality of how the parts are interacting and even gives you a sense of appreciation and compassion, right? Like I feel such compassion for Jay's managers in that moment because it's like, oh my gosh, we've been working so hard and yet the very thing we feared is happening. And then her exiles, given her experiences, of course they're going to be very, very activated by that. And then the wonderful intention of this firefighter that's coming in to save the day from this highly explosive system that's, been implode or is exploding in this moment, right? So, yeah, just a lot of, uh, again, it brings perspective, clarity, appreciation for the parts and gratitude for their jobs, understanding. And then, like Ralph says, the solution is not to strong arm any of them to say you just need to stop it or try harder, right? They're trying the best they can. That is to understand that the self can come in and can heal the this incredibly terrible moment or moments of a sexual assault, right? That this part is holding by themselves that really needs witness and loving attention and reparenting or redoing of that scene and unburdening of all those burdens and beliefs that they took on from that. Like once that can happen, then that part is not as easily inflamed, right? And the managers don't have to work so hard to like keep their energy at bay. Or the one, going back to the moments where the young girl experienced the parents fighting about money and, you know, devaluing one another around it. And they need the adult self to go back in that situation to help them process it and let them know that they are valuable despite how much money they make. And, just to reflect back truths like that and retrieve them out of those moments and help them unburden. And once that happens with the core of that egg, and essentially then the self expands because those parts offer self energy as well once they're unburdened, then when something similar happens, a boss or somebody comes with criticism, The system is not as volatile. It just says, oh, okay. They may not take it to heart. Like they may say, oh, this has to do with the boss and some unreasonable expectation they have. Do I decide to do what they want or not? Or maybe they're able to say, ah, yeah, maybe I could do that better. I didn't understand what they wanted before. I'll make that change, right? And it's not necessarily a match in a in a haystack, right? Okay. So I hope you appreciated that example. If you have any questions about any parts of the parts map or kind of how to make a parts map for yourself, if you try to experiment with parts that you've met, and again, you don't have to have all the pieces at once. You can gradually put them on there as you gain more and more insight after you go inside and meet with parts. So thank you for listening. If you have any questions, any comments, leave them in the comments below. And I would say if you have watched this far, put in the comments an emoji of an egg because the parts mat kind of looks like an egg, right? That'll be fun. Okay, I look forward to seeing you next time.